So what I'm going to talk about, actually, it's funny that Ian Kriegsman's on, because what I'm going to talk about is actually Ian's fault. So, which I'll explain in a second. But I'm assuming you might have, if you haven't used it, I'm assuming some of you are at least aware of live bindings. Yeah, they were, so live bindings are about letting you bind data to a, well, to something else. It's usually a control on your screen. Yeah, that's the default sort of use case. You've got a UI element like an edit box, and you want to bind it to a field in your data set, or to a property in another component or something. Yeah. And so it works on VCL and FireMonkey, and it came, I can't remember the exact version. It was like XE2 or something, maybe they introduced it. And then they've kind of done various bits on it over the years. Right up until 10.4, there was actually a big performance improvement on it, kind of a needed performance improvement. But the key part of it is that it's all visual. Yeah. I'll do really quickly, I'll do the demo that kind of anyone who wants to show you live bindings does this simple demo, and it's a typical demo. It's kind of useful up to a point and then completely useless after that. Let me add an empty project here. How do I create a new project in my group? Oh, I better click on the group. Okay, add new project. Let's create a VCL app. Okay, I've got an edit box and a label. That'll do. And I want to bind my edit box to my label. Yeah, so don't worry, it's going to get a bit more complicated than this. But if I bring up the live bindings designer, yeah, I get these little things that represent the components on my form, and I can drag my the text field of my edit box over to the caption of my label. Yeah, and that creates this thing called a bindings list. That's where all of your live bindings are stored. And then, excuse me, if you click on this little arrow in your live bindings designer, that represents the binding. Yeah, and so I don't know how visible my screen is, but each of these bindings, these connections, these arrows, are a class. So this one's a T-link control to property. Yeah, so it's linking my control, my edit box, to this property of some other, in this case, component, the caption property of my label. Yeah, and so you can run it, and you know, type. You can already see that the contents of my label has been mapped across to my edit box, and I can type into my edit box and update my label. Yeah, so woohoo! That's the hello world of live bindings, and often that's where the demo stops, and they go, rightio, off you go. Now bind your application. Yeah. Fantastic. So that's kind of what live bindings are meant to do. Yeah. And in this size application, yeah, that's fine. You can come in here, you can click on the binding, and you can see the various properties of it. You can see here, here's the control that I'm binding my edit. Yeah. And here's the component that I'm binding it to, my label. I can set up, if I want to format the text on the way across. So when the value is being passed from one to the other, I can get it to format it, you know, prefix it with a string or uppercase it or whatever. And that you can also then use this custom parse property to undo that formatting. Yeah. So it's kind of like, how do I format it on the way out before it's displayed, and how do I undo that formatting to get the raw value to shove back in? Yeah, that's fine when you've got, I don't know, 5 or 10, you know, bindings on your form. Problem comes in when you've got, you know, a typical application where your form might have hundreds of components on it. And so you end up with this just dog's breakfast of components, or these little boxes in your live bindings designer with lines going everywhere. Yeah. And there's stuff you can do. There's this ability to create layers and move these items between the layers, which is fine if you're more organized than I am, but I never do that because I never kind of think of it. And so for a long time, it's kind of bugged me that if I want to go in and see all the details of these bindings, I've had to come in here and then find the right box, or click around on my form and get it to highlight which is the right box. And then usually my box has 4 arrows coming out of it, and I have to click around and find which arrow is the right one. And you've got to do that over and over and over again to figure out what's bound to what. Yeah. So I've whinged about this for a long time, and I remember, I can't tell you how long ago it was, but it was at an ADUG symposium in Melbourne. I was grumbling about this to Ian, actually, and he was also saying, yeah, I agree, it's terrible. And I said, I've thought about writing just a little library to make this easier, yeah, to make creating them in code easier. And he said, well, yeah, you should do that. Let me know when it's done, off you go. And so it went on my list of things to do and got promptly shoved down the list. But a few years ago, I was doing a project that had a lot of bindings in it. And this started to really annoy me again, because you can create these things in code. Like if we have a look here, if I bring up the, let me add another edit box just to my form and another label. Okay, and we'll try and create the same binding between them, but we'll do it in code, like without using my little library. Yeah. So if I have a look at the form as text, if we scroll down, let's get rid of this. We can see here's my bindings list, and then inside it, here's the actual binding that was created. Yeah. So I can steal this and go back out to my, let me bring it back up as a form. Okay. And if I go over to the, I don't know, the on-show event or something. Where is it? There it is. I can, let's just put that in there for reference. So I could do something like this, I guess, where, let me create a field, which is my F binding, and it's going to be one of these. Okay, and then I can create it down here and say my F binding is equal to one of those dot create. Can't remember. I think actually I don't want self in there. It's been a while since I've done it this way. But then I have to basically go through and set all of these things. F binding dot, what is it? You don't actually need category. That's just for the user interface. You can say control equals edit one, and F binding dot track equals true. Now some of these are probably default values, like that are not default values, but yeah, it's sort of set in the constructor. So maybe I don't need to do some of these, but it's kind of hard to tell which ones you don't need to do. And component property. Let's borrow a caption. Okay. And then the one that I always forget to do, you have to say F binding dot binding list, I think it is, or bindings list is equal to your F bindings list to actually add it to the collection. Yeah. So that's kind of almost the bare minimum. And this is a super simple binding. Yeah. If you're binding a grid or something like that to a data set, it's, it's significantly more code. And so it doesn't take many, creating them in code is good because I get to have one place where I can look at it. but it's also kind of rubbish because I end up with pages and pages of code, and I've just got the same problem. I've swapped a diagram which is messy for a whole bunch of code which is messy. Yeah. So this was what I was grumbling about, and this is basically what Ian kind of told me to put my money where my mouth was and do. And so I wanted to replace this with a nice, easy way of creating these bindings that was kind of, so that you could kind of, they were in one line kind of, and you could read them almost like a sentence. So you could just come in and see this component is bound to this one, and here's the formatting, and here's the tracking, or whatever. Yeah. So that's where a few years ago now, actually, I started on this and got it working up to a point that sort of did what I needed, and it's been kind of floating around inside Code Partners for a few years now, using it on various projects. And I always thought I should, it's actually been up on GitHub for a while, it's just been private. And a few times I've thought, oh, I should make it public. There's nothing, it's not that complicated, you know. And I never really got around to it until John asked about this, and I said I could talk about, he asked about doing a presentation, and I said, well, I could talk about this, this thing. So anyway, so it's up there now. I can stick the, I'll stick the URL in the chat window if anybody wants it. But what I'll do, what I thought about doing tonight, I don't know how to get the chat window now that I'm presenting, but anyway, I'll stick it up there at the end when I'm not sharing my screen anymore. So what I thought I'd do tonight is show you how it works. Yep. So if you're using LiveBindings, you can steal it if you want. But then probably more interesting maybe is actually go through some of the details of how it works. Because even if you're not using bindings, LiveBindings, there might be some stuff in there that you can steal for other things. Yeah.
Malcolm.
Yeah.
The link's on the page for tonight.
Oh, is it? Oh, good.
Yeah.
You've
The
already done
ADUG
that.
meeting page for tonight.
Cool. Awesome. All right. So that's the idea. I want to replace all of that with one line. And so what I started with was actually, before I'd even written the library, what I started with was with the line of code that I wanted to write. I wanted to be able to write bindings list, something like bindings list.1 bind component. Yep. And this code won't compile yet because we haven't brought the library in. But bind component, edit one, to component. What's my other one? Label one, caption. Yep. That's what I wanted to write. Yeah. Now it's not going to compile because the library's not there yet. Yeah. But I kind of, that doesn't quite do everything that that other one does. So I wanted to be able to say, you know, track it. And what's the other thing? Yeah, now that does everything that that other one does. Yeah. So that's kind of what I wanted to be able to write so that it read like a sentence. From my bindings list, bind my component edit one and track the changes and bind it to this other component label one and its caption property. Yeah. So that's where it started from. Yeah. And so if I add this library to my search path, so that we can actually use it. Where are we? Delphi compiler. It's just a single file. Let's add it. Yeah, that'll do it. Okay. So if you add the users clause LiveBindings.fluent, okay, that should let that line of code compile. Yeah. Okay. So if I run it, oh, actually, sorry. that'll work because that's the one that I already had the binding on, the one that I created visually. So this should be what, edit to and label to. Okay, let's do that. So the first one will still have its visually created one, and this one will have its code created one. Yeah. Okay, so this first one is the one that we created visually. This one is the one that we created using code. Yeah. So that's the idea. Yeah. Now let me bump up the font here a bit. Let's maybe have a little bit of a look how it works and what some of the stuff you can bind, because it's more than just edit boxes and labels. It's kind of grown as I've needed to bind more stuff in projects. I've added to it, so it doesn't do everything, but it does a reasonable amount at this point. So the first part of it is this bindings list. That's actually the standard bindings list that comes with Delphi and C++ Builder. Yeah, I haven't changed it given what Brian was talking about a second ago. All I've done is added a helper class to it to hang these top level methods off it. Yeah. If we have a look, okay, somewhere in here will be my helper class. Yeah, here we go. T bindings list helper. Okay, and you can see it's got 4 top level methods. I want to bind a component, I want to bind a list, I want to bind a grid, which are the 3 that I've used quite a lot. The 4th one, bind expression, is, if you look, I've actually flagged it as being experimental. It works-ish, but there's still some issues I'm trying to chase out of it. So I would mostly rely on the first 3 at this point. They've had a fair amount of bashing on projects. But that kind of gives you the entry point to be able to start using this library. Yep. So just by adding the LiveBindings.fluent unit to a form where you've already got a bindings list, you can start using it. Yeah. Now, let me go back over here. So bind component, edit to. Let me switch back to some more examples. In this case, let me show you a few bits of what you can do, and then we'll have a bit of a look at how it works. Yeah. And I'm assuming if people have got questions, they're going to just interrupt me, because I won't remember to ask people if they have questions. So if we just run this guy, and we'll have a bit of a look at how each of these work. So this is just a little example project that I've got. This first one is, like we just did, is set up kind of with a standard visual binding. Yeah. But I've got if we bring up the LiveBindings designer, that's, I think, yeah, over here. That's this binding here that was created visually. And you can see I'm using that custom format to say whatever the string is that's come into the edit box, prefix it with the string foo. Yeah. So if I, where are we? Did I stop that running? Okay, let me do it again. If I've got Melbourne in here, when I refresh that binding, it prefixes it with the word foo. Yeah. And parse does the opposite. Yeah. So that one's done visually, but these ones I've got set up so that it creates the binding underneath these bind buttons. So at the moment here, there's no binding created. But if I set up the binding and then do that, you can see it binds across. That's pretty much the same as the one we just saw. If we have a look at the code, okay, it's just bind component, track the changes, and bind it to my label 2. Yeah, so that's basically the same as the one we saw. This one next one is kind of bidirectional. So if I make changes here, oh, sorry, no, this one's not bidirectional. This is doing the formatting business that we saw up here, okay? And again, all that is in the source code is the same, bind component, but we stick .format on the end of it, yep, and put in the same format string, yeah? Now, under the covers, this is, all it's doing is creating the exact same classes that would be created if you dragged an arrow across and set all the properties, yeah? So once, after this code runs, what you end up with is no different than if you'd visually created it, yeah? At runtime, once this creation has happened, at runtime, my code's not involved anymore. It's just the standard binding, yeah? It's just setting it up for you, yeah? And we'll have a look in a second how it does that, yeah? I think this next one is bidirectional. I got sick of edit boxes, so I've set up some checkboxes. And so I'm creating a binding, bidirectional binding between them. Yeah. So if I check checkbox 1, checkbox 2 gets checked, yeah, and unchecked, and vice versa. If I uncheck checkbox 2, checkbox 1 gets created, gets set. Yeah. And so that one is, again, you know, it's almost boring. I've said bind component checkbox 1 and track the changes in it. Bind it to component checkbox 2, and the property I want it bound to is this is checked property. And then I've stuck bidirectional on the end. There's 3 values you can have. It can be bidirectional. It can be from the target to the source, or from the source to the target. Yep. And I think it defaults to, it's weird. I had the naming around the wrong way for a long time until I realized that the bindings framework, in my view, has them us about. Like what they refer to as the target is actually the source, and what they refer to as the source is actually the target. But even though I believe I'm right, I followed their method. Yeah. So you can do bidirectional stuff. I can't remember what this one's doing. Let's have a look at what it's doing first before I show it to you. I think I do. I think this one, so far all of the examples have been binding to a, like a control that you've dropped down. Yeah. This one is binding edit box to the caption of the form. Yeah. So I'm saying bind my edit component to self, which is the form that I'm part of. Yeah. Or you could put a form variable in there if you wanted. And it's the caption property of my form. Yeah. So for example, if I set up the binding, you can see I've got form 4 in my edit box, which is up there, but I can change it, and the caption of my form changes. Yeah. So you can basically bind to pretty much any property of any object. Yeah. To take that one a bit further, the next one, and I'm kind of rushing through these a little bit, just because I don't think this is terribly interesting. The interesting bits when we look at how we do it, or hopefully it's interesting. This one takes that kind of a step further, and I'm binding this edit box to just a variable, a field of my class. Yeah. So this f-string var thing, if I go up to my form, is just here we are. It's a string variable, a string field in my form. Yeah. So I'm binding this edit box to the value of that string variable. Yeah. And I think in the constructor or something of this form, I'm setting its value to, yeah, here we go. Initially on the show event, I'm setting the string var just to have that string in it. Works. But I can, once I've done the binding, I should be able to change the contents of my edit box and have it drive down into that field of my class. Yeah. And I've got just so we can check what's in that thing, I've got this edit button set up just to take the string var value and shove it into this other edit box, just so we can see what's in there. Yeah. So if we have a look, if I set up the binding, okay, you can see it's got the initial value from the string variable. But if I type something else in here, like, I don't know, foobar, okay, now you can't see it yet, but now behind the scenes, that binding has plugged that value into the field on my form. And if I click this refresh button just to read that in here, we should be able to see what's currently in that. Yeah. So that's starting to get kind of interesting, I think, where we're binding to things that aren't even visual. Yeah. Make sense? Okay. This next one. So let me bind this. I'll show you this. This one's binding between a Boolean and a string. Yeah. So if I check my checkbox, I get true showing up in my edit box. And if I uncheck it, I get false showing up. And this next one goes the other way. Yeah, I guess I could make that bidirectional. But this one takes whatever I've typed into my edit box and shoves it into the is checked value of my checkbox. Yeah. So I can put in true, I can put in false. I think I tried this a while ago. I haven't tried this in a while. I think it'll handle ones and zeros. And then anything else that, oh, that's a zero, actually, that's an O. Anything else that is not one, I think, just gets treated as a false. Yeah. Can't remember if it's case sensitive. There you go, it's not. Yeah. Makes sense? So you can kind of transform. In fact, this is a built-in transformation. I'm not doing anything special to get that happening. I'll show you the binding that's behind that one. But using the format and the pars, you can do transformations, custom transformations if you want to. So that one's just this one. Bind component, my edit 7 to my checkbox, the use check property of my checkbox. Yeah. A couple more, just have a look at. Here I've got basic, in the show event of my form, I'm just setting up a client data set with a couple of fields in it, first name and last name. And I've just put a couple of records in here. Yeah. So then in my, behind this grid, grid binding button, you can see I'm not calling bind component, which is what I've been mostly doing before. I'm calling bind grid, and I'm giving it the grid that I want to bind to. I'm giving it the default column width, and then I'm saying bind it to my bind source DB, which again is the standard live bindings component that you set up to point at your data set, your client data set. Yeah. And so if I actually run that guy, pretty sure I've still got that running, but anyway, I'll write another copy. If I bind that, I've got the contents of my client data set bound to my grid. Yeah. Equally, this is a list box up here, and I've got it set up. Let me just get that out of the road for a second. I've got it set up so that I'm binding this list box to the first name, I think, field. And then I'm binding this edit box to the current records first name field, and this edit box to the current records last name field. Yeah. So if we have a look, I'm just saying bind component edit 9. I'm giving it a format string to stick Mr. in front of the value, and I'm binding it to field. So before I had all of those two component methods. Now I've got a to field method where I'm saying I want the first name field out of bind source DB. Yep. And I'm doing it again for edit 10, binding it to the last name field. This one, I think this one by default goes bidirectional, but here I'm limiting it to only go from the data to the component, not back the other way. So effectively this edit box becomes read-only. Yep. And then I'm binding the list. That's the other one we haven't looked at. Instead of bind component and bind grid, I'm binding the list in my list box to the first name field. Yeah. So if we have a look at that, if I set up the bindings here, it's the same data that's in my grid down the bottom, but you can see the first name in this edit box over here is getting the prefix put on it. And if I move it around, it should move through them. Yep, and I should be able to change this to something else, okay, and have it update wherever that's bound to. Yeah. So none of this is, I guess the point of this isn't to say, woohoo, live bindings is awesome. I didn't do any of the live binding stuff. Yep. The point of this is to say that the creating them in code part is much simpler and I think much more readable. Yeah. We've kind of gone from these multi-line horror story for even a simple binding to these one-line, you know, sort of sentence-like statements. Yeah. But under the covers, we end up with the same thing. Yeah. Does that make sense? So that's kind of what it is. The bit I'm kind of maybe more interested in talking about is to have a look at how it works. Yeah. But did that all make sense? I kind of threw a whole bunch of stuff at everybody.
Yep.
Is there anybody going, what?
No,
Sorry?
Malcolm.
Yeah.
Graham Fish there. It seems as no, I don't use live bindings very much at all.
Yep.
It seems as though the source component or the source always seems to be using, is it the default property or is it the default property, or how could I say for the edit button I wanted to send its color to another color property?
Yeah, so these, actually, probably the best way to show you, these, if you go into the bindings list and go to create a new binding, there's a bunch you can choose from. Now these, when you use the live bindings designer, when you draw the arrows between the controls, it's going to create one of these quick bindings for you, these top ones. Yeah. And they all sort of have a default property that they work off. Yeah. And so on and I've got to get this round the right way, on the target, which is where, bizarrely, which is where the data is coming from, you've got control. You can specify the property, but on the source, it just defaults. So for an edit box, it's the text.
Yep.
For that sort of thing. Now, your other options is to use these other ones. Yeah, that most of these links and lists
is 7 o'clock p.m.
Thank you. These other ones are mostly older, but these binding expressions give you much more control. And that's when I was talking before about, I said that in this live bindings thing, the grid and the list and the component I've used a lot, but more recently I've added this bind expression ability, and it's not 100% working yet. But what that would let you do is write something like, what that would let you do, for example, is I could write, let me change this one. Instead of saying bind component, I could say bind expression, in capitals.
Yeah.
And then that would let me say edit to, and then the property name that I wanted.
Okay.
And so I could say color, for example, and then to expression. And the same thing, I could say label to dot, not dot, but, and then the name of the property that I wanted. Yeah. So the expressions actually give you a lot more power, but you have to be very specific about which property that you want. Yeah.
Yeah, and let's say, for example, font.style. Instead of color, could you put font.style?
Like a child.
Yeah.
Yeah, you should be able to. And actually, I've just remembered you can actually do this through the visual thing as well. I always forget this, but if you bring up the live bindings designer Where are we? Here it sort of shows you that default, like if we've got an edit box, it shows you that text property.
Yeah.
Yeah. But if you click on these, the little, what are they called? Ellipses, the little dots at the bottom, you get a full list. Come on. You get a full list of all of them. And so we could say, I also want to have access to color. And notice it supports sort of child.
Yep.
What do you call them? Sub properties or something.
Sub properties.
Yep. So there's font. We say we also want font color and we want caret color, and then they'll show up in your little box here, and you could drag from this over to something else if you wanted. Yeah. So you can do it, and I think under the covers, let's just try it. I've got a feeling under the covers that creates an expression one for you. Let's get font color over here. Let's drag it across and see what it creates for us. Oh, it doesn't want me to. See, that's the weird thing about this. I'll show you another example of this in a second. The designer actually limits you. It doesn't let you do some things that the framework will actually support. Yeah, and I don't know why. I've never found out. Like for a long time, I thought you couldn't do this. Let me drop a couple of edits out here. For a long time, I thought, you know, here's my edit 2. Let's pull that over there somewhere. Here's my edit 3. Let's pull that over there as well. You know, I wanted to be able to bind my text property of edit 2 to my text property of edit 3. Seems reasonable. The designer won't let you do it. And I assumed, well, that must mean the framework doesn't support it. But it actually does. I accidentally found out, let me just put a button in here to set up the binding. I kind of forgot that the designer didn't do it, didn't let you do it. And so I was just testing it and went bindings list 1 dot bind component, what are they called? Edit 2 and edit 3, that can't be right. Edit 12 and edit 13. Yeah, well, my eyes are going. Edit 12, 2 component, edit 13. Oh, and I better give it the property name. Text. That'll actually work. And that's not me doing anything. That's the live binding framework supports that. What have I done wrong? Oh, I'm still running. There it is. Let me kill this. Come on. Is it running now? There we go. No. Why won't it let me? Is this Zoom playing silly buggers with my? Or is it?
You got multiple things running, perhaps?
Maybe. Let me just.
You missed out a text field in edit 12 in your bind component.
Oh, here? No,
Yeah.
because it's bind component, it takes that default property.
Oh, okay.
If it was bind expression, it'd want me to tell it the. No, it's complaining that it can't create the output file because my code's still running.
No, okay.
Control F2 for breaking it.
I think it's because I'm in VMware and it's trying to be helpful.
What's project 2?
Hang on. Let's go single window. Anyway, so I'm getting, I'll show you that in a second, but I'm getting way off topic. So Graham, I think that, does that answer you, that before answered the question?
One of my questions, but I'll see you later.
Yeah. Oh, look at me. I've got heaps of them running. Okay, let me kill all of those. And then hopefully I can run it and show you that this does actually work. Yeah, so if I create the binding, I should be able to go like that. And then Oh, if I'd made it bidirectional, it'd probably work. Bidirectional. There you go. Yeah. So can't even remember how we got onto that, but basically the live binding designer kind of stops you from doing a bunch of stuff that actually the live bindings framework will happily do. Yeah, anyway, so that was a bit of a side effect from what we were talking about. Okay. So any other questions before we actually look at how it works?
I've got a couple of quick ones, Malcolm.
Yep.
Cross-platform?
Yes.
Great, okay. Just further to Graham's question about other properties. So I commonly do things like read-only and enabled and, you know, validation. So I've got to use the expression one then on every time, do I?
Basically, yeah, that's right. That's what I was going to have a look at, because I think unless where are we? Oh, that's right. It wouldn't create it for me. Yeah. So anytime I don't want to do what that standard property, you know, like the text in the edit box or whatever, the only way I've sort of found to do it is using the expressions. And that mostly works. The only reason I hesitate about that is I use it in projects and it works, but as soon as I need to start going bidirectional, I've found a couple of bugs that I still haven't chased down in it. And it's the only reason I haven't, I guess, is because lately I haven't needed to do it. And so it's gone on the pile of things to worry about next time I need it.
Okay. I'd be happy just go from a view model object back to the property of the controls. As long as it went that direction, I'd be happy.
Yeah, yeah. And so, and that's actually kind of what triggered me to do all this at the beginning. I don't use this only for that, but it was for sort of like MVVM or MVC or whatever, where you're binding from a business object back to your UI and wanting to have all of this stuff just in one method where it could set up all the bindings. That's kind of where this came from. So in that I use the expression one a lot. Okay.
And with the track, I thought that was tracking on key press for edits and things.
Yeah, it basically, if you call track, wherever I've got one, yeah, there we go, there's one. You're basically saying you want it, you're requesting that the framework more actively tracks the changes in this case in the edit box, yeah. But it's a request. It kind of depends what this component is. And so, for example, edit boxes, like actually this one's, I think, a FireMonkey application, but edit boxes, it makes no difference.
Yeah.
It still only registers the change on either loss of focus or hitting the enter key. But for example, I think, I could be lying, but I've got a vague memory that progress bars, if you call track on them, they track every change rather than just at the end when you let go.
Okay. So if I had, say, an email field, an input email field on a form, I can't give the user visual feedback to say when that email is valid?
You can, but not through the visual designer, and right now not through this. I mean, we can set it up to do it. Right now, you'd basically have to, in your edit box, for example, in your on-change event, you'd basically notify the bindings, telling it to refresh that binding. So you can do it as often as you want, but if you want it to happen automatically, it depends when the live bindings framework has observers that they've written for a whole bunch of these common components.
Yeah.
And they tend to be fairly conservative from a performance point of view.
Okay.
They kind of only do it when they really, really have to.
I'll look forward to your update to have that feature.
I'll add it to the list, mate. You know how many years it took to do this. So,
Malcolm, it's Lachlan here.
Hey, Lachlan.
I had to duck out for dinner during your presentation, so I missed a fair
All
bit
the
of it.
best bits.
Yeah, probably. Can you just show me the line of code that you're binding, say, like an edit control to a database field?
Yes. Let me find where I did that. I did do that. Oh, here. So for example, this edit box is bound to a field of this client dataset.
Yep.
Yeah. And I've got this bind source DB hooked up to the client dataset.
Yep.
So that line is, I've got two edit boxes, so there's two lines, but that's that line, for example. That one's got a format in it. So I'm binding the edit 9 component and I'm specifying a format string and I'm binding it to field first name of bind source DB1.
Okay.
Yeah, these two are the same. They just don't, that line is the same. It just doesn't have a format on it.
Right. Okay.
And then
What's
this
from
one
data?
is binding the list box to the first name field.
Right.
Yeah.
What's from data to component on the second binding?
Where am I looking?
End of the.
Oh, here. So that's about direction.
Okay,
So
right.
you can choose to go from.
So why didn't you need that on the top one?
Only because I don't need it here either. This was just
Okay.
an example of saying, effectively, this edit 10 becomes read only because it's only pushing changes from the actual source data to the component, not the other way.
Yeah. Yep.
Whereas this one, I think, defaults to bidirectional from memory. Yeah, you could have bidirectional, but it's defaulting to that.
Okay.
Actually, let me run it up. I think that's right. It's been a while since I tried to change the last name. Let me bind that and bind that just so we can see all of it. So yeah, I can change the first name and that's bidirectional. But if I try, yeah, I'm typing and it's not, it's made it read only basically because I'm saying only take changes from that data set to this component, not the other way around.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Make sense?
Yep.
Cool.
Malcolm?
Yeah.
Through the IDE, it seems like we can only bind components to components.
Yeah.
But what if we need to bind components, a visual components to an object?
Yep. Yeah. So you're right. It's hard, or maybe not even hard. It may be impossible to do through the live bindings designer, but through the code, through code, you can do it. And I think, where did I do that before? Was that one maybe, or that one? Actually, both of those, I think. So this one's binding this edit box to the caption of the form, which is granted is a visual component, but and then this other one is binding it to just a string variable. So that could equally be an object. Like for example, if I had a business object called, or even if I had a list, so if I had a field called fMyList, and I could say the property I wanted of it was, I don't know, count or something. I don't know, something like that. Yep. Or if, you could even do it this way. The expressions will handle this as well. Yeah. Or f customer dot first name or whatever you wanted. Yeah. And then equally, that's probably, this is what I was saying before. Let me do that. Otherwise I won't understand why my demo doesn't work next time. Equally, that's where I was talking about before, where I was using these, somewhere we did an example with expressions. Can't remember where that was. Where did I say bind? Oh, it was on the other form. Was it? Yeah, this one. Where I'm saying, rather than saying bind a component to a component, I'm saying bind, here's this bind expression, and I want to bind it to this other bind expression. And so this expression could, in this case, it's an edit box, but it could equally be any expression you wanted to do. I could say my biz object, and the property could be account number or something. Whatever you like. Yeah. So you can actually bind from a non-visual class to another non-visual class if you want. It doesn't have to involve the UI at all. Whether you want to do that's a totally separate question, but you could. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Cool.
So if you've got a form with frames on it, can you bind a component on one frame to a component on the other?
Yep. You can bind between frames. I thought you were going to ask the harder question of binding between forms.
No, just frames.
Yeah. No, that's okay. And that's actually the other place that I've used this is in mobile apps. I do a bit of reparenting frames onto tab controls. So like you select a different thing and it creates an instance of a frame and binds it onto and parents it onto a panel or a layout, or in my case a tab control.
Yeah.
But when you do that, obviously it's hard to do your visual bindings when it's not on the form. But having these code bindings means I can just bolt through and bind all the stuff that I want, and away you go.
Yeah.
Usually I have a function to call on the frame, and then pass it the bindings list, and it can set up its own bindings kind of, and away we go.
Okay, that's interesting. Thanks, because I've never used LiveBindings because I just looked at it. And
it's hard.
I sort of had my own way of binding data that I'd developed before bindings came into being, and just stuck with it. But I can really see some ways I could use this to complement that, or maybe in places change it, but certainly to complement things and automate things that now I'm having to do manually.
Yeah, I mean the part of the problem is that in XE2 or 3 or whatever it was, when they introduced live bindings, they were a great idea, but they were not finished. And I can't remember, it took them a few versions before it reached a point where you'd kind of go, oh, okay, yeah, this is up to the job, sort of. And then, and they've like I said before, in 10.4, they did a bunch of performance improvements that helped a lot. But I think in those first couple of versions, people tried it and went, oh, I can't do this, can't do that, I can't bind between two edit boxes. I'll do my own. Yeah. Whereas, 9 years later, if they tried it now, possibly would be okay, but it's 9 years after they gave it a shot and wrote it off. So I kind of persisted at it because I was doing a lot of FireMonkey stuff, and you didn't have the VCL data binding there, so it was either this or totally roll your own. But you did have to persist, because like the naming is weird. In my view, the targets are actually the sources and the sources are actually the targets. And it took me a while to figure out that if I wanted to, what you would do in a data set, what do you have? You have your on set value and on get value or something like that. It's been a while since I looked at that, but you've got these events, on get value, on set value, kind of makes sense what it's for, right? Well, you don't have that in this. Instead, you have format and parse. And it took me a long time to figure out that, format and parse are just get value and set value. Yeah. I don't know why they just didn't call it get value and set value, but they didn't. Yeah. So it took a bit of persistence, I think. So I kind of understand why people didn't always have that persistence. Yeah.
Malcolm, do you actually bind things other than database fields to edit controls and things? Like because when I bind things, it's probably 95 to 99% of it is DB fields to the edits and grids and so on and stuff.
Yeah, probably the most common thing. I mean, you do a lot of database fields because that's kind of what you end up dealing with a lot. I do that, and also fields of objects. So whether it's a business object or something like that, or even just a data object, like one we were doing a little while ago, we had JSON data coming in and populating into an object, sort of a data object that represented it, and then binding from those fields to user interface controls. So they're probably the two most common things.
Yeah, because I think that was one of the mistakes I made with it, was like, you've got this binding engine that can bind to almost anything, yet all this ever went to doing that, whereas 95% of what you want to do is just bind to a data item of some sort. If it had been more focused on that, like the traditional data aware controls, it would have been not quite so ambitious, but more targeted. I think it would have been more successful.
Yeah, I think my versions get blurry, but I think the framework came in XE2, and then it was either XE3 or XE4 when this designer came in. And it was only when this designer came in when they brought in those quick bindings that the designer uses. That's kind of the point where you got that fairly easy field to control sort of binding. But by then that was 1 or 2 versions, and people had tried it and stepped away from it already.
Yeah.
You know, that said, I think it's like a lot of stuff, you know, people, you know, they launch something with a big bang. People look at it, some use it, some don't. The dust settles, and then 12 or 18 months later, you kind of, or maybe more than that, 3 years later, you kind of find that people have just quietly started using it, and it's not the big flashy thing that everyone was talking about, but it's just kind of getting used under the covers. You know, FireMonkey's like that for me. Like for years, what I would hear in forums and that sort of stuff was that, oh no, FireMonkey's not up to the job. But then I'd meet customers who were using it and deploying and shipping, and so, you know, it's kind of like if version 1 had been baked a little bit more, you know, that bang initially would have maybe gone off a little better. But
Malcolm, what have we got in terms of performance hit? Is it very significant?
For LiveBindings or for my library?
Would it be the same?
At startup, there's probably, no, there would be an overhead for mine. You know, the streaming system from the DFM, pretty optimized, more optimized than my code, probably. So yeah, so at startup, or whenever you're creating the bindings, I should say, because it doesn't have to be startup, but at the point of creating the bindings, it's probably, there's an overhead. But at that point, my code's not involved anymore. It's just the binding the same as if it had been created through the designer. So at runtime, if you like, after that startup, it should be identical.
And is there a significant hit at runtime?
Not that I've noticed. I've never bothered measuring it, but that's probably because it never hurt enough to bother measuring it. You know, it's like this, you know, most of the, when you're pulling in data from a database and when you're making network calls, they're usually the scary places for performance that I look first, you know.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah. Okay.
Malcolm,
yeah.
I'm sort of surprised to hear that the live binding designer stops you from doing certain things, and then you think, oh, it's not possible, but then the engine can do. So actually, that's good that you reveal that, because I've seen a couple of people trying this stuff, but they usually don't finish it off. They sort of, at some point, they give up and start coding. My only comment is like this helper class that you developed, it doesn't have any unit test, but I was thinking like would be very suitable to have a set of unit tests around it. And then you could have a unit test for checking your bind components and then input the value and have that rendered as a sort of form thing or something that actually picks up the value and then validate if the output is correct. And if you do that, then the unit test could be an example as the same sort of lines as what you demonstrate now, but also it's regression. So whenever you add additional functionality to your framework or try it on new components, because there are so many components, you could figure out if things have broken, or you might change to an older or a newer version of Delphi and all of a sudden the behavior is changed. You could capture that as a later on thing.
Yeah, I totally 100% agree with you. I actually do have some unit tests for it. Like if you have a look in my other repos, I generally start with unit tests and then
Nice test-driven development sort of approach. Yeah, it's nice.
To a degree.
Yeah, I know nobody does it perfect. Don't worry, but thinking helps.
Yeah, no, I do. But the only reason it's not in the repo at the moment is, well, two. No, actually, I was going to say there's two reasons, but it's really only one. They're kind of a little embarrassing, but I'll get over that and put it in. Yeah. So okay, give me a couple of days and there'll be some unit tests. But they'll be poor unit tests. I promise you.
No rush. I just want to have the idea launched that I think it's very suitable for unit testing because it's just a set of functions that you can cover up with cases, and then you get some code coverage if you like. And I think it helps you going forward. And it's nice what you made. I like it.
Yeah. Okay. So let's have a quick look. And I know I think we're meant to finish at before 8, aren't we? So
yeah, that's about right.
Yeah. Yep. All right. So let's have a quick look at how it works. Most of it's not that interesting because it's been floating around for a few years. It's not using the latest and greatest language features or anything like that. It's pretty straightforward. Like it's mostly just interface driven. So you can see I've got some interfaces which represent the sources and some interfaces that represent the targets. Yeah, that kind of let me, because what I wanted was, when you remember I said I wanted, let me get rid of that line. I kind of wanted to be able to write this single sentence. Yeah. Bindings list, bind this component to this other component. And so effectively what's happening is when you call bindings list dot bind component, what that's returning, if we have a look at it, is this is in my helper class. It's returning an iComponent target. Yep. And if we have a look at iComponent target, it has a bunch of methods on it like format and parse and track. But most of them, those first three, they just return itself. Yeah. So we've got a class that implements an iComponent target somewhere else. I'll show you in a second. You get that back by saying bind component. But then if you call format on it, it's doing something, which I'll show you in a second, and then it's just returning itself. And then you could call parse on it, and it's doing something internally and then returning itself. The only way you kind of get out of this target interface is by either binding it to something else, which is then going to return a source interface. That could be to component, which would return an iComponent source, or to a field, for example, which would return a field source if you're binding to a database field. Yeah. So it's this kind of, I think they call it a Fluent interface. That's why I've called it LiveBindings.Fluent. This kind of Fluent approach where the classes or the interfaces mostly return themselves or act as gateways to the next thing that would then maybe do a few things to call it to return itself. Yeah. So if we have a look at the actual classes, most of them, if I have a look at that call to, where was it? That helper class, which was somewhere here. Where was my helper class? It'd be up here somewhere. So if I call bind component, we can see it's, we'll come back to these first few lines in a second, but at the end, it's creating an instance of T component target, creating it, and it implements this iComponent target interface. So it's returning that interface implemented by this class. But when it creates it, it passes in this binding state instance. Yep. So up here, we're creating an instance of T binding state, creating it. It's owned by this, what would self be in this point? Probably, I'd have to think about that actually. normally it would be that thing, but that's a helper. So I don't actually, I'll take that as a lesson to find out what self is inside a method of a helper class.
Yeah, no, it's definitely.
But it probably is.
It's definitely, if that's a helper for T bindings list, then it's definitely a T bindings list.
Yeah, that's a helper for a bindings list. Okay,
yeah,
good.
it's a T bindings list. Yeah, it is.
So we're creating a binding state. We're setting up, the target that gets passed in. We're setting that into our binding state. We're saying that the target type is a control. So this binding state business is really just a data object, and it gets passed between each of these calls. Yeah. So for example, when I call bind component, that's what we were just in. It gets created, and then I call track, which returns the same instance of iComponent target, so this same T component target, but eventually we leave that when we call toComponent, yeah. And so if we have a look at that, it'll be down here. This is what I don't like about interfaces. Where's my toComponent? It'll be on my
interfaces make it harder
table
to find the implementation, and you can't surf to it. It's so annoying. I know.
Here it is. So when we call toComponent on our component target, we're ultimately creating our component source, but we're passing it in that same binding state. Yep. So we're kind of all through this sentence that I wanted to be able to write. As we go through each one, we're passing that component state along until we finally have all of the bits filled out that we need. Yeah. So if we look at this, let me draw a horrible picture for you. So the start of this is bind component, which is where we bind component. Yep. So that's that first call, and it returns a T component target. There's an interface, but component target. Yeah. And then that we call format on it, but that's basically just returning the same component target with some extra fields filled out on that binding state. Yeah. But eventually we escape that component target when we call toComponent to bind it to the other label. Yeah. And that's when we get to a T component source. Yeah. And then we can call bidirectional on that, or there's a few other methods you can call on that. But all those other methods are doing filling out more information on that binding state. So the theory is by the time we get over to this, by the time we get over to the component source, or any of the sources that kind of end the sentences, by the time we get to that, we've got a filled out binding state. Yeah. Then, whatever the last method is that we're calling, we start unraveling. Yeah. We start, we exit this last, whatever it is, toComponent method. When we exit that, the interface for that, the reference count goes down, triggers the destructor on my T component source. Yeah. And it's in the destructors of all the source components where the work gets done, where the actual bindings get created under the covers. Yeah. So if we have a look, I don't know if that drawing helped, but let's have a look at the code. If we have a look at these, there's all of these potential source interfaces. Yep. For the different things that we can bind as sources, component sources, bind source, which is an awesome name, where the source of my binding is a bind source. I told you the names were great. A field source, where it's a field of a data set, yeah, or an expression source, yeah. For each of these, a class that implements one of these interfaces will be that final final class here. Yep. And so when the reference count on that class gets down to 0, when we exit that last method and it gets destroyed, it's in that destructor here of the class that implements them. Here, here's my base source, for example, component source, bind source. Notice they've all got an overridden destructor. Yeah. And so, for example, if we have a look at the component source destructor, this is the point where we start looking through that binding state data object that we've been passing along, that's been building up all of the knowledge about the binding that we want. We then start interrogating that and actually doing that manual code that we would have done originally, yeah, where we create a T-link controlled property in this case because we know it's a T component source, and then we have a look if the direction is either I think it's probably bidirectional, yep, or target to source. Then we create the necessary T-link control property. This is the standard binding that the visual designer would create for you, yeah, in the DFM. Remember before I stole that code out of the DFM here? It was creating a T-link controlled property and I kind of converted it into this, yeah. Well, it's this code which is now happening in that destructor for us. It goes through, sets the control, the component property, the track, the format, the parse, its active state, okay? If it's going the other way, it sets it up slightly different, yeah? If we're instead binding to a field, its destructor will have a look and say, is the target a list? Okay, then we want to create a T-link list control to field. Otherwise, if the target is a control, we want to create a link control to field. Yeah, it's basically doing that same manual code that you would have written, but it's just triggered by the destructor of the final source component or source object. Yeah, and the reason that I did it in here, so it's basically the destructor of the object returned by this guy is what does all the work. The reason that I did that, I think originally I had it actually in the destructor of the bind state. Yep. So that data object that we were passing along where we're collecting all the details about the binding, when it got destroyed, I was doing the setup. But then I realized that that would let me do something really stupid like this. I could write code like that, bindings list one.bind component, and not finish it. That's valid code. That'll compile, but the binding, we don't have enough information for the binding. Yeah, it's incomplete from that point of view. But if I was doing it in the destructor of the bind state, that would trigger at this point because we had a bind state, reference counts go down to 0 of the containing class. That would get destroyed. I'd start to set up a binding, and I'd then have to figure out, well, do I actually have enough information to create a valid binding? Yeah. So by instead doing it in the destructor of the source, the only way I can get a source is by specifying first off a target, and then eventually, maybe through a couple of other methods, eventually specifying one of these two bindings, yeah, by specifying a source. So I kind of know the only way I can get to the destructor of a source object is by getting all of the necessary information. Then I don't have to worry about is it valid or not. I've got to know that I've got enough information to create it. Yeah. Does that make sense, or have I just totally confused the hell out of everybody? Silence.
That makes sense.
It makes sense. Thank you, Sue. Yeah, so it's kind of one of those things that I kind of thought the obvious place for it and the place where it should be was actually going to be lots of work. And it turned out the easiest place to put it was probably one of the smelliest places from a code smell point of view. You know, part of me was saying it shouldn't be there. That's wrong. But it was also way easier to put it there because then I didn't have to worry about have I done all of the necessary steps. I let the compiler sort of worry about that for me, because I knew that I couldn't get to the here without having done those previous steps.
Malcolm, I'm looking at the source now. T-binding state has the source and target as T-object, but everywhere here it seems that it's T-component is your base class. I'm guessing that's because the bindings has that limit, or?
Sorry, I need to catch up to what you're saying. So you're saying on the binding state?
Yes.
You're saying source, oh, I see what you're saying. Source is T-object and target is T-object.
I'm the opposite to Lachlan. I never use bind to databases. I always bind to a view model object. And so I have a T-object or T-object descendant. I'm not interested in the component layer from the data point of view.
So there's two answers to that. The first answer is I don't remember. The second answer is...
You're calling it Daniel Andrews, yeah.
The second answer is I have this vague niggling memory that because, you know, my target, if I'm going in through bind component, if I'm creating an I component source or an I component target, then my source and target are going to be T components maybe, or T control. I think it's T component.
Why would that be the case?
Well,
or why does
I think we can have a look, but I think the interface of the method, the bind method, actually restricts that.
Okay.
Bind component. Yeah, here we go. So that gets created inside this method, and here it's kind of limiting it to only a component. Whereas I've got this vague feeling, and I could be lying, but that when I then went to say bind expression, because bind expression also uses bind state under the covers, I've got this feeling it's at that point that I needed it to be broader than a component. So under the covers, it could be an object.
Okay.
Now, the only thing, if you notice, my binding state is in my implementation section. So nobody gets access to my binding state except these classes. Well, actually, the only things in the implementation section, apart from my helper, are my interfaces. But these classes down here are the only things that actually touch a binding state. So in there, I could be okay with saying I'm storing it in an object, but I know it's actually a component or whatever. Yeah. Does that make sense? But I think the real answer is I can't remember.
Yeah. Okay. I can perhaps have a play.
Yeah. If you're worried that this means I can't bind to something that isn't a component, no, that's not what it means. And maybe it could be looser. I don't know. Maybe the bind component thing could accept something higher up. It might be like those edit boxes that I didn't believe you could bind to each other until I accidentally tried and it worked. So it could just be, you know, I could be looser on that than I'm aware I can be.
Thanks.
Make sense?
Yep.
Okay. So that's really, apart from the helper, the helper class, like the helper class, I think is the most modern thing in this whole framework. Yeah. So that's probably the constraint on how far back you can go in terms of where it's usable. Everything else is just interfaces and interfaces and classes, which has been there since what, Delphi 3? Well, and live bindings, which is, so that's the other constraint. Yeah. So yeah, I think that the main thing sort of that I wanted, like I said, when I wanted to be able to write this sentence, and I wanted Code Insight to tell me what was valid. You know, if I was binding to a component, I wanted it to offer me track. But if I was binding to an expression, there's no track on expression. So I wanted it to not be able to give me track at this point. Yeah. So I wanted Code Insight to tell me that. I didn't want to just remember. So that was one thing. I wanted it to be strongly typed. And the second thing is eventually I figured out that the right place to put the actual creation of the bindings was in the destructor of the source. Yeah, the source that shouldn't be called the source, but anyway, it is in the destructor of the source. Yeah. And then from that point on, just like if you had created these using a bindings list, from that point on, they're owned by the bindings list, just like they would be if you'd created them in the visual designer. So at shutdown or when you want to notify something or whatever, all of that's handled by the bindings list. Pretty much once they're created, my code is out of the picture and it's just standard live bindings code. Yeah. Make sense? Cool.
Yes.
All right. So unless you've got questions, I've got nothing else to say about it.
How do you bind from one control from form to form?
Were you here when that question got asked before, or are you just taking
I was, yeah.
Oh, okay, good. I have tried it, and I can't remember if I ever successfully did it or not. I can't remember. I got a feeling it's one of those things that I never got to work, but it may be smarter people than me can get it to work.
What about binding to an object list or enumerated list?
Sorry, what was the second one?
Or an enumerated list.
Yep. So yeah, that's when we were talking before about using it for MVVM or whatever. Yeah, I bind to. I use this to bind to like a T list of some object all the time.
Good.
The only trick is having a list that is bindable. Sorry, that sounds stupid. Is having a list. So I can't remember what it's called, but I think in my MVVM code I showed just a silly little enumerated, basically a list that had an enumerator that bindings would be able to handle.
Right. Okay.
So the hard bit is actually the list. Once you've got that, it's kind of pretty easy for a list of objects. I mean, a list of strings or something like that, that's easy. But if you want a list of objects, like a generic list or something like that, the bindings engine doesn't care as long as you feed it something that it can recognize. And I think in that example code, I've got an example of it's a really quite simple wrapper that makes a list bindable, if that's the right word.
You could do something like with JSON, convert it into name value pairs and then bind that to a grid, for instance, or to a data set.
Yep. Yeah, there's a few different ways. The other way that I've seen is there's some, I haven't used it, but one of the guys who was doing a project for us, there's some way of, with the JSON framework that's in Delphi, of basically filling it's not a client data set, what's the FIDAC version of that called? Is a mem table? Filling a mem table with JSON, and then you can just bind it as if it was a data set. Cool. So there's a few kind of different ways you can go at it, I think.
Yeah, thanks.
Sorry, I had to take some time out for a urgent phone call, so I might have missed this. Right at the beginning, in your first example, when you were doing the linking the edit back to the label, nowhere that I could see were you actually, in your code, did it actually mention that it's a text property of the edit that's the feed? Is that, where is that inferred from?
That's inferred, let me just find an example. Actually, there'll be one here, like this one. Yeah, here. So I'm saying bind component edit to component label 2. Yeah, and so you're saying here, I'm not saying it's the text property of the edit box. Yeah, that's because the T-link control to whatever the name of that, I'll tell you, here it is. T-link control to property class, which comes as part of the LiveBindings framework, kind of, it has default, if you like, that's maybe the wrong word, but default properties that it uses for different targets. And so for an edit box it's the text property. For a label in FireMonkey, it's the text property. In the VCL, it's the caption property, etc., etc. So it kind of, these quick bindings just have these default values. But that's where you can use, I was saying before, instead of using bind component, which is what that should be, yeah. Instead of using bind component, that's where you can instead use bind expression. Bind expression, and then you get full control over, you know, you want the, what's an example? Well, this is FireMonkey, so I guess you could do position.x or something like that, some sub property or some other property, you know, color, for example, color, and bind it to expression and bind that to the color of the label or something like that. Yeah. So these bind components and bind lists and bind grids kind of use these quick bindings, but then bind expression is the one you fall back to if you want to have more control. Yeah. And that's not a me thing. That's a LiveBindings thing. If we go into our bindings list and go to add a new one, these quick bindings up the top here, they're those ones that kind of default to certain typical properties. But then this bind expression one here is the one that I'm using under the covers when I say from expression and to expression. That make sense?
Yeah, thanks.
I think I'll be able to use that immediately. The changing the colour. I've got some using one of the styles from FireMonkey, and it doesn't always set text colour to something I like, so I can just bind it to something else on different component state or something like that. And it should perpetrate, because at the moment I'm doing it manually, but there are some times, like if you resize, where I haven't yet picked up the right place to reset it, because I've got to reset it in a whole lot of places. But doing it by a live binding should make it just a one-off statement much more reliable.
Yeah, the process I kind of went through is when I first got my hands on LiveBindings, I thought, awesome, I can bind everything, and proceeded to, and ended up with one of those LiveBindings designers with 400 arrows going every which way. And then when something didn't work, I had no clue why. One of those arrows wasn't in the right place and I didn't know which one. So then I backed right off and I was using LiveBindings for the bare minimum of things until I started doing them in code, and I could instead go, okay, well, here's my section of code with all of my UI binding, my sort of color related bindings, and here's all of my bindings that are related to my database, and sort of have it look at it in code. Yeah. And so now I've kind of gone back a little bit. Now I bind a lot of things that I kind of didn't used to.
Opens up a lot of possibilities.
Cool.
Yeah, I think I sent you an email, Malcolm, where I mentioned I've got a wrapper as well for this sort of stuff. But mine I focus pretty much just on data. I don't really use mine to bind component properties one to another sort of thing, or that sort of stuff. Yeah, mine's not Fluent either. It's just I use a static class, and but yeah, the thing I like about mine is I don't require you to put any components down on the form aside from the edit you're binding. You don't have to put down a bindings list or any of the others. They're all sort of created behind the scenes in code and stuff. Yeah. So it's sort of like add a unit to the users clause and then just say my T-code bindings dot bind, and then the control and the data field sort of thing. So it's not as flexible as yours, but it's got less overhead in setup on a form sort of thing. You can just get straight to it.
Yeah, I mean that makes a lot of sense. I mean, where mine kind of came from was I kind of had some bindings done visually and I wanted some in code. And so from that point of view, I kind of already had a bindings list on the form, and I just wanted to be able to have this certain set of bindings that I was doing in code because they were the ones I wanted to understand, whereas these other ones were kind of set and forget, and I'd already drawn them. I'd already drawn the arrows, so I kind of didn't worry. But yeah, with this one, you do have that extra step of dropping your bindings list down. Yeah.
Yeah. That we were talking about binding from one form to another form, because I only have one bindings list in my whole application, and it's not sitting on any form.
Oh, there you go. So you already.
I reckon I've never tried it before, but I reckon it would probably work the way that I've got it, because it's.
So have you got a bindings list on a data module or something, and then
just created at runtime as well.
Oh, so each.
It's just in a class.
But each form doesn't create its own at runtime. It uses the central one.
Just uses the one, yeah. So, and the bindings just get added and removed to that list as the forms are created and destroyed.
Yep.
So
in that scenario, if it's the same bindings list, it might actually work with two forms.
Yeah, I've never tried it, but I'm going to tomorrow.
Good. I look forward to hearing.
Is your bindings list, Lachlan, the same component that Malcolm's using? It's just that you created at runtime? Or
it gets down to the very bottom layer. It's create like these ones we can see on screen here. This T-link grid to data source, T-link control to field. I'm creating instances of those at the very bottom layer of the wrapper as well, same as Malcolm is. But I've just got a very different. My API is very different to his.
Yeah, but there'd be no reason why you couldn't create, say, a global bindings list at runtime and then use Malcolm's library with it.
It probably would. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I'm just trying to understand.
Yeah, I mean, in this case, I'm using a binding list dropped on my form, but it could be somewhere else.
Yeah, it doesn't. I don't have any problems having one global bindings list. So I don't think you would have a problem using a global bindings list with Malcolm's library either. Although you've got to remember, how are your bindings being destroyed, Malcolm? Is it because the binding list is being destroyed, then the bindings are going?
Yeah, so that might be one thing to look at, is the ability to undo it when the form goes away.
The time is 8:00 p.m.
I guess that means wherever. Like I rely on my bindings get destroyed because I make the owner of the binding the component that it's binding to, like the T-edit that it's binding to. I set that as the owner of the binding. So then when the T-edit gets wiped out by the form, the binding that is connecting to that also gets wiped out.
That's interesting. I've never tried to do that.
Yeah, it works.
And it's quite happy. Like you don't get weird issues of the list not owning the binding.
No, it seems to be fine. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So, I've been doing that a couple of years.
Sorry, what's that, Sue?
Version 2.
Well, the most important thing, I'm getting hassled by the guys internally because we've mostly been using this on, most of the binding stuff that we've been doing has been on FireMonkey stuff. And the grids in FireMonkey are relatively simple. Yeah. One of the guys is just on a project now where he's using it in VCL and against the a much flasher grid. I can't remember which one it is. So he's been peppering me with things going, add this, add this, add this. So I keep telling him, look, it's there in the repo, you add it and just, go for it. But it seems like a lot of open source, it's open source in spirit, but it's really just one guy maintaining it.
Well, you might get a bit of help if a few people start using it.
Maybe.
You could actually have your binding lists as a lazy instantiated singleton.
Good.
In a unit, perhaps.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. I was just wondering if you would have a t-edit and you would have 3 labels that needs to be updated, would you write out 3 separate bindings, or would you do one call and then basically keep on method chaining so all 3 labels gets updated?
As it currently stands, you'd need to do 3 bindings.
Yeah.
Because in that call to, hang on, go away.
Yeah.
In that call to, you'd kind of do 3 that looked like that line, yeah. And in that call to component, remember each of these is kind of passing that binding state along between them.
Mm-hmm.
And this one inside here is going to take our source component, our label 2, and shove it into that binding state.
Yeah.
And so if you then stuck another 2 component on the end of here, you're actually going to end up overriding that earlier target.
Yeah.
So you'll probably end up with, 3 of those, just label 2, label 3, and label 4.
You can't keep on chaining where you say, sort of broadcast. I use the same source and I updated label 2 and 3 and 4 in the same sort of thing. Yeah. I don't know. I'm just telling you a bit.
No. That's not even version 2. That's like, I don't know, 3 or 4.
Okay, that's clearly a separate code. That's fine.
That's going to make the code as hard to read as the LiveBindings visual designer.
Yes. The cure is worse than the disease.
Yeah, that I'll do now.
Okay. Malcolm, thank you very much for doing a full show.
No worries.
We normally split it into 2, so you did the heavy lifting tonight. So
no one told me I could get away with doing half
on the
of
question time. So anyway, thanks a lot.